But first, the Prime Minister, 3 strikes and you're out? Well, not for the Canberra Press Gallery. You see, they don't think this Prime Minister's broken any promises. But you and I both know that the fundamental promise that he made going into the last election, the whole point of his Prime Ministership, the promise with no asterisks, that cost of living would be lower under a Labor government. That was the promise. Reality, of course, well, quite the opposite. Then there was the promise as he and candidates and shadow ministers went from construction site to construction site saying we're going to build more infrastructure, this road here and that bridge there, and obviously no dams, but plenty of promises that there was going to be infrastructure. But then, of course, they turned around, delayed an awful lot of projects and then just cut 82 projects that they had gone to the election in part saying that they were going to deliver. And then there's, of course, the stage 3 tax cuts. Now, let's not all get very boring, as if we're all super excited about the tax rates other people pay. The reality is that what was legislated over multiple years, discussed over multiple elections, was going to result in a lifting of the tax-free threshold, which meant that those who were at the absolute bottom of the income scheme, they were paying even less tax. Those that were starting to move up to the middle, well, they would get a tax cut. In fact, that has already been received. And then people over $80,000, $180,000 as well, they would end up getting a tax cut. But as you know, the Prime Minister was never going to change those, was he?
I can confirm that we haven't changed our position.
We have no change to our plans. Tax cuts will happen in July.
We haven't changed our position.
I've said we haven't changed our position.
We haven't changed our position on the stage 3 tax cuts.
We have not changed our position on stage 3 tax cuts.
They've been legislated. We support them. Our position hasn't changed.
But the far left has always hated these because anyone earning over $80,000 in their mind is rich and therefore taxes should be increased, never cut for these people, let alone those evil buggers over $180,000, regardless of how many nights that they miss putting their kids to bed or how long they end up spending away from home because they work in a FIFO job. You know, nothing to see here. But there are plenty of people like the Australia Institute, which is the think tank of the Greens, the ABC, the Guardian, all the rest of it. Often you'll see the Australia Institute constantly quoted as the big brains who say we should, among other things, get rid of the stage 3 tax cuts. Then, of course, the think tank for the ABC is reported by the ABC as people agree with the think tank, and mounting pressure becomes the narrative, not news. Remember, we've talked about that a lot over the past few years, where you try to make it seem like something is happening and going in a certain direction because it's the direction you want the news to go in. Well, then, of course, we learned today via Chris O'Keefe on the Drive Show on 2GB. He says that the government has made a decision that they will not deliver the tax cuts as legislated, as voted on and as promised. Instead, they're going to be fiddled around with.
Anthony Albanese could ditch tax cuts for Australians on higher incomes.
So if you earn more than $180,000 a year, you will get $6,000 a year back under this plan instead of $9,000.
9 News understands the plan to be put before Cabinet would lower the top tax bracket to $180,000, saving $3.6 billion per year, with the money saved to be redistributed to lower income earners.
So seemingly the major change in all of this is moving from a $200,000 beginning of the highest tax bracket and keeping it where it's been for a long time, which is at $180,000. The money saved, of course, is just money taken from people who are currently earning somewhere between $180,000 and $200,000. Now, we are not talking about a huge number of people, but I'm going to explain why this particular group of people is a bit of a financial piñata for the Australian government. But as we know, the plan is for the Prime Minister to spend the whole week talking about this, and that's why Labor MPs are going to be called back to Canberra for a special caucus meeting where, of course, they'll debate what has already been decided to be these changes. Now, whether they're fiddles or total removals, who knows? We'll all find out in the next couple of days. But we learnt the cost of doing this, if they bring their staff with them, is going to be the best part of $500,000. Now, again, perfect way, as we explained last night, the politics, the optics, say cost of living more than doing anything about cost of living, and then magically everything's okay. Now, again, there's no changes when it comes really to cost of living. Instead, it's going to be about tax cuts that, of course, don't kick in until the 1st of July. They're not going to be immediately in place unless, of course, the Parliament urgently votes in February. It's all to say that it's going to get better not that long after the Dunkley by-election. But of course, what is bizarre about all of this are some details. And again, can I go back to that number and how we get to 500,000 people, $500,000 being the cost of this showboating that'll be happening on Wednesday, and then the home game of the Press Club in Canberra on Thursday, which is that analysis by News Corp is that the average MP, senator and employee travel expenses will be about $468,000. Labor politicians based outside the ACT will be travelling there, and they'll be doing so on Wednesday. Now, of course, what is fascinating here is the politics that is being sent as a message. Remember, more than 70% of the country believe, in fact 74% of the country believe that cost of living is the number one issue. More than 80% of people say the government's not doing enough. The government is in a bind where if they just started writing cheques for $1,000, well then presumably that would end up being inflationary. But if the idea is a tax cut, which means eventually you'll have a little bit more of your own money to take care of, then it's not inflationary. But I want to show you how the spin is going in and around this announcement. And I'm obviously not going to have any problems with people being able to keep more of their own money to be able to pay the excessive bills that have all happened since this bloke became the Prime Minister. But what about this spin that comes to us via some of the papers today, that all of this is going to be focused on low to middle income people? And of course, all of this is a way of winning back middle Australia. In fact, quite specifically, PM hints at cost of living relief for low to middle income earners. Now, where have I heard that term before? Oh, that's right. They're the 10 million people that this government already took $1,500 off. Remember, during the pandemic, low and middle income earners around the country were able to have an automatic tax return of at least $1,500 out of the federal government, meaning they were able to keep $1,500 of their own money. This was to, in part, help pay for all of the issues that came in and around COVID. It was kept around for another year, but because they wanted to get the budget back to surplus, they decided that this money had to be taken away. And in actual fact, the Assistant Treasurer said that this was to deal with inflation, that the government had to hold on to more of your money because it was a way of dealing with inflation. Now, presumably, tax cuts, meaning you get to keep more of your money, will somehow now also be a way of beating inflation. No, of course, two things can't be right when it comes to this. But again, remember, 10 million Australians didn't get $1,500 last financial year, won't get $1,500 this financial year because of the decision that was made by the Albanese government. And even left-wing commentators like Ross Gittins in the Channel 9 newspapers referred to the move as sneaky. You may remember night after night when we talked about this as something that was very obviously happening before our eyes, an example of something that the government should not have done, should have delayed for another 12 months to guarantee that Australians had $1,500 extra of their own money. Now, about 16 million Australians have a job right now, so 10 million of them being able to have an extra $1,500 last year would have really helped. Instead, the government sat back and didn't give the money out. You see, there were no by-elections. There was no polls they truly had to worry about. Their assumption last year was that everyone would be distracted by the voice, and largely that's what Canberra politics did. And you see it in the reporting. Watch how few people in the next 24, 48 hours will even mention that the government already took $1,500 off you. So now if they're going to magically give you $1,500 back, well, it's already what you already had. If you end up slightly in front of it, well, minus whatever the number is by 1,500, and that is the decision that was made by this government not to have that automatic tax return for 10 million people. Now, I'm going to make an uncomfortable point for some, but it is a reality about why a conversation matters about people who earn over $80,000, over $100,000 and over $180,000. Now, is that a lot of money when you are on a fixed wage, a fixed pension, or you are earning the absolute minimum wage? Yeah, of course it is. But I want you to see all this conversation about cancelling the stage 3 tax cuts, which were about making sure that people who were on $180,000 would be taxed the same as people who were on $40,000. Now, of course, the government would still get more money out of you because you are earning more, which means you pay more tax. But by getting rid of that extra $20,000, they're able to, well, change the tax picture. But have a look at this. The latest numbers we were able to find today via the Australian government's data websites and the Australian Tax Office in particular. It shows this. Now, let me explain. On the left-hand side tells us what percentage of the population earns $18,000, $45,000, $120,000 or $180,000. Now, those that are earning over $120,000 are just 11% of the Australian working population. But on the other side, you will see what percentage the people who earn that amount of money pay in tax. Now, 19% of all tax is paid by the 7.6% of workers who are earning between 120 and 180. And then 35% of all tax paid in Australia from workers is paid by the 4% of workers who are earning more than $180,000. So let me say this nice and clear. In Australia, 11.9% of workers pay 55% of the tax in Australia. Now, the assumption from lefties is that they can afford it. And can I just be very clear that I agree with a progressive tax system? Of course, it is ludicrous if half of your wage is going if you're earning only $50,000. And again, while it hurts if you're somebody who is earning over $180,000, the reality is if that's what pays for the social safety net and national defence, then we're okay with that as a system. But what is fascinating is the number of people who have got millions of dollars in the bank, who vote Teal, who donate to Teal, or even have decided to back in people like the Greens who say, well, I'm okay, so this doesn't matter. But what about the FIFO worker? Why should the FIFO worker have to pay even more tax than they were expecting to pay because both parties had voted on and then promised at multiple elections that they would get a tax cut? Now, again, I understand why your bank manager may not be the person who you are automatically sympathising with, but think about the person who may well live in New South Wales but has to go and work in the mines in Western Australia. Think about the person who works 60 hours a week, not the average 40 or even more. Now, again, no one is saying these people are poor, but when 11% of the population is paying 55% of the tax, then when they get a small tax cut, they're still going to be paying the extreme bulk of tax in Australia. But the game here is that the assumption is that anyone over $180,000, well, they vote Liberal, so who cares? Or they vote Teal, which means they stop the Liberal Party, so who cares? It's a little bit like their attitude towards regional Australia. Because you keep voting for the National Party, well, then they'll cancel the road projects that they promised that they would do at the election because you didn't vote for them. It'll be interesting to see when we talk about this a little later tonight about how rich is too rich and what do people think is rich. Again, if you are on a fixed income and you are hearing me talk about $180,000, I understand why you think that person is rich. But if you're somebody trying to pay off a massive mortgage in Australia, because that's the same city that you grew up in, that's the place where your family is, as the prices keep going up, then that number, yes, while bigger than the vast majority of what Australians earn, is not incredibly rich. In fact, on housing, it's important to note that after the elbow dozen of interest rate rises that we have had since this Prime Minister came to power, with his Treasurer as well, the amount of money that you have to pay back more this year than 2 years ago when we had that election is pretty stark. If you are on the average of paying off about a $500,000 loan, whatever that is, around the country, you have had to find in the past 12 months an extra $13,500. If you're on a $750,000 mortgage, well, you have had to pay an extra $21,000. If you're trying to pay something off for $1 million or more, you have had to pay an extra $30,000. So while the lefties want to say that your income has gone up, so therefore your tax should remain through the roof, the reality is that your bills from the one-bedroom unit in regional Australia through to the 2-bedroom unit on the outer suburbs or the 3-bedroom or more a little closer to the city, the reality is that paying that off has become hugely more expensive in the past 12 months. So I get the politics here. Most people in Australia do definitely earn under $100,000. The average is about $77,000. But the idea that anyone earning over $100,000 is some sort of moustache-twirling, monocle-wearing billionaire is not quite the reality. And while there are moustache-twirling, monocled billionaires, they well and truly, of course, should have to pay their fair share. But the idea that 11% of the country pays 55% of the tax, when in actual fact those same people, because of all of the different giveaways and all the rest of it, they don't get much back from the government, yes, occasionally on things like negative gearing, then the system is kind of balanced where it is. As soon as you start to have a scenario where those people don't claim anything from the government, yet you keep the tax rates incredibly high, well, of course, that becomes, in my view, unfair. Not because rich people should be stomping on poor people, but because they're already paying their fair share, regardless of what the lefties say. And meantime, you should also know that there are now 1 million Australians that are currently having mortgage stress. That's the reality of the economy that we are right now. This is why one speech and one caucus meeting and one fiddling of the books at $180,000 is not going to change things. But Albo and Chalmers, they think that the politics is on their side, and they can backslap each other all the way to another election win, beginning in Dunkley in just a few weeks' time.